Hello, my name is Robin Bevan, and welcome to a new episode of the Awakening to Our Cultural Crisis series. In the last episode, we talked about the collective shadow, so the darker aspects of human nature and concepts linked to scapegoating and how this, ties into Jungian psychology and, the deeper layers of the collective unconscious, linked to Dionysus, Wotan, and the sovereignty goddess, which we'll go much deeper into within the entire series itself. However, before we really can do that and really dive deeper into the Wotan pattern and the sovereignty goddess and Dionysus and various other linked things, also linked to the scapegoat complex, and the phenomena of scapegoating, we really have to first dive much deeper into, the basics of Jungian psychology and the Neolithic, next to a lot of Proto-Indo-European foundations, very much, before we can dive deeper specifically into the Choreos pattern, the Archetypes pattern, and the sovereignty goddess, and all these linked things. It's important to understand this context to fully comprehend all of the later things that will come. And for those interested, I also have a playlist with recommended videos as well that go deeper into linked concepts as well. Think the UFO phenomena from a Jungian lens, or the Kraken and the collective unconscious as a force, or Dionysus, or the Great Mother, and linked to the Anima and various other concepts that shed more light on some of these aspects that we're talking about here within this series. So it's not going to be that immediately there's going to be this very deep dive into, things that people might otherwise not understand, but a slow progression from one topic to the next, to build the proper foundation before diving into deeper waters. But now diving deeper into symbolism and consciousness then. At the core of Jungian psychology is the idea that our human psyche is not merely a blank slate or a product of personal experiences, but is intricately connected to a universal collective dimension. The personal unconscious and identity does exist, yet this is not all there is to being human. And this collective dimension of the psyche, known as the collective unconscious, contains a wealth of archetypal energies, which are primordial, innate, and universal symbols and themes that reside in the depths of our minds. And these archetypes are not learned or culturally acquired, but are part of the shared human experience. And so when it comes to archetypes, they are deeply tied to culture and ancestry inherited through generations. The archetypes within the collective unconscious are dependent on the specific culture and one's ancestors, as these are inherited. Meaning the focus of the particular archetypes and the pattern, how it exactly plays out, even though there are much deeper shared human patterns as well, where specific cultural versions are clothed in specific cultural garb, but underneath it, the essence of it goes way back and is tied to one's ancestors. And archetypes are not isolated symbols, but are deeply rooted in specific cultural contexts and transmitted through generations. And for Indo-European people, this goes back to the Proto-Indo-European culture and the archetypes prevalent within that Neolithic culture that forms the bedrock of the archetypes within the later Indo-European cultures. Though on an even bigger scale, this goes all the way back to even earlier times, and as such, all humans share these archetypes. The difference between different cultures, civilizations, and tribes, and what archetypes are more in the focus, and what is associated with them, including their mythological narratives, are due to, for instance, cultural, historical, and environmental factors, next to other factors both within the culture and between cultures. So even though we as humans all share the same archetypes as a whole, such as the mother, father, child, hero, and nature-related archetypes and other archetypes I did not mention here, these are colored by these factors. As such, these factors also cause a particular focus on certain archetypes over other ones, so ones valued and others who are avoided. Throughout very many generations, this sets up within a particular culture or tribe of people what we could call a specific collective psyche that has its own collective unconscious, with specific archetypes more to the forefront, who are deemed more important to that culture over other archetypes that do exist but have less influenced that culture over many generations. The collective unconscious being a reservoir of shared universal experiences and symbols that are inherited across generations. Archetypes being innate universal symbols or themes present in the collective unconscious, which influence human thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And similarly, we as individuals inherit all archetypes, but particular archetypes, due to our own specific ancestral line, can have an influence on what particular archetypes are more dominant within our psyche versus which ones are less influential. Generally, we tend to have certain inherited dominant archetypes within our psychological makeup, which represent important parts of our authentic self, but influences of those not directly related by blood, but responsible of raising us as children, and also environmental factors, including trauma, can have an effect on the expression of these archetypes, and introduce other archetypes as well, that become more influential, next to potentially creating complexes. So there can be an interplay between factors where, for instance, the warrior archetype becomes repressed through trauma. Let's say a psychological complex associates assertiveness with bad us being unfairly punished when we speak up about being mistreated. And then this can lead to a repression of this assertiveness. For instance, if it is associated with, if I'm assertive, I'm gonna be harmed, so I better not be assertive. For instance, just to add something in there. Where another archetype can take on a compensatory role and can become a way of coping with the repression. However, a part of our authentic whole becomes repressed, and especially if this is connected to a more dominant archetype, this can lead to, for instance, depression, where trauma in particular can also imprint certain archetypal patterns more strongly, influencing emotional responses, coping mechanisms, and behavioral tendencies, where it can lead to certain archetypes to become more dominant due to certain traumatic experiences. This becoming a response to the trauma, introducing this archetype and skewing their initial trajectory, next to the individual then often also dealing with psychological complexes. Traumatic experiences, including scapegoating, can introduce new archetypal patterns as a way of coping or adapting to the challenges presented by the trauma. And these new archetypes may take on compensatory roles or serve as protective mechanisms, even though complexes are involved in this process as well. And these compensatory roles may become part of the individual psychological landscape or could be temporary. Think, for instance, the outcast archetype, to add that in there. If someone gets, pushed into, for instance, the scapegoat role, where, that gets activated. But especially if the trauma is long-term, this can really make such introduced archetypes more stronger in the individual. So even after recovery, the newly introduced archetypes may still remain part of the individual's psychological makeup. And healing doesn't necessarily mean erasing or eliminating these patterns, rather it involves creating a more balanced and integrated relationship with them. And next to this, certain archetypes may also be more pronounced or emphasized in our individual psyches due to the cumulative influence of our familial lineage. Think a certain profession being common, where caregivers, mentors, or influential figures in early life also contribute to the formation of our psychological patterns. And these influences can introduce or emphasize certain archetypes in our psyche, further contributing to the unique composition of our individual unconscious. And regarding the more dominant archetypes within our psyche, these are not just archetypes we just associate with, nor a persona, social mask or a role for the individual. In contrast, dominant archetypes go beyond mere social roles. They shape the core personality of an individual. These archetypes symbolize innate traits and behaviors that feel natural to the individual, influencing how they navigate the world and relate to themselves and others on a deeper, more authentic level. And the archetypes that reside in the collective unconscious and are innate primal patterns of human experience and understanding shape our thoughts and behaviors even before conscious thought. The archetype being more like the energy of the pattern and the universal expression of the pattern, where the exact symbols and forms of these patterns of thought, emotion, and behavior are influenced by what is called a cultural complex. The cultural complexes, based on archetypal energies, give the archetype a form with linked values. These values, in turn, shape the identity of the culture and the behaviors of its members. Our perception of reality is then also influenced by our subjective experiences, beliefs, and cultural conditioning. But that does not negate the existence of an objective reality. It just means that our understanding of it is limited by our human perspective. So while our subjective lens is individual in many ways, there are also shared patterns and archetypes that exist within the collective unconscious that influence our subjective lens beyond cultural distinctions. And these archetypes and patterns can manifest differently in different cultures and societies, but they are still fundamentally part of the same underlying human psyche. So while cultural and societal factors can shape the expression and attitude towards these patterns, the patterns themselves are not socially constructed, but are instead innate to the human psyche. And the archetypal patterns provide a framework for organizing and interpreting our experiences, and the complexes are the specific patterns of behavior and thought that arise around these archetypal themes. And from a Jungian perspective, a complex is a pattern of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that is organized around an archetypal core. When an archetype is unintegrated or distorted, this can lead to the formation of a complex as a way of coping with the resulting psychological tension. And cultural complexes are part of this. They can also arise as a result of social and cultural factors that impact the expression and integration of archetypal patterns. These cultural complexes can be seen as distorted versions of archetypal themes that arise due to social or cultural factors such as trauma, environmental factors, or cultural norms and values. However, the underlying archetypal patterns themselves are innate and not socially constructed, where cultural complexes are patterns of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that are organized around a particular cultural theme or issue, and they can shape individual experiences and social dynamics. And when we are not aware of these cultural complexes, they tend to live a life of their own. As Jung noted regarding personal complexes, they are relatively autonomous and want to preserve themselves. And when the complex is distorted, and with it the archetypal energy, this, however, becomes problematic, leading to unhealthy expressions of an archetypal theme. Think how if the archetype of the hero becomes distorted, it can revolve unconsciously more about becoming more powerful and for one's own gain, even if hidden behind a thin facade. Or when the trickster archetype is repressed in a culture, it can come out in distorted and destructive manners. What we do have to keep in mind regarding these distortions is that cultural complexes can become this way due to historical and social factors such as trauma, oppression, and cultural clashes. This then, furthermore, can influence the expression of archetypal patterns such as power dynamics, gender roles, and social hierarchies. These cultural complexes can create distortions and imbalances in the expression of archetypal patterns and can impact individual and collective psychological functioning. The displacement of paganism by Christianity could have given rise to such cultural complexes, distorted versions of archetypal themes, even though I want to add that there's been plenty of distortions happening before that as well, so just saying that. But these complexes may manifest in the form of unresolved tensions, conflicts, or biases between the pagan archetypes and the dominant Christian narrative. And the current culture war may thus be a continuation of these unresolved complexes, reflecting shifting attitudes towards archetypes and cultural symbols. And we can see this conflict already during the late medieval period in Europe, so 1400 to 1500 AD, where there was a shift away from the traditional spiritual and philosophical beliefs that had been prevalent in the previous centuries. And during this time, there was a tension between the growing desire for individuality and self-expression, and the ongoing efforts by the church to maintain its authority and control over the masses. In addition to the dominant Christian beliefs, there were also elements of folk religion and paganism that were still practiced by communities, and these traditional beliefs were often discouraged or suppressed. As such, despite the displacement of pagan practices, these archetypal patterns and symbols persisted in various forms, often relegated to the collective shadow. The current culture war may thus reflect the re-emergence of these archetypes as they strive for recognition and integration within the evolving cultural landscape. I do want to say, though, that the specific ideologies are responses to the times and historical circumstances as much as a response partially born out of the fact that certain archetypes were relegated to the collective shadow. As such, certain elements, are missing, which can, for instance, lead to the marginalization of certain people or also the mistreating of nature, to just name a few examples. So the cultural framework itself can lead to the exclusion of marginalized elements associated with the collective shadow, resulting in a splitting of that what is in the collective shadow versus that what is dominant within the culture regarding the archetype. That is deeper, than what is there between the splits of these archetypes that we see. For example, cultural complexes around gender roles can create distortions in the expression of the archetypal patterns of masculinity and femininity, leading to rigid and limited gender roles that do not reflect the full range of human potential and experience. Similarly, cultural complexes around social hierarchies can create distortions in the expression of the archetypal pattern of power, leading to unequal and unjust social structures that limit individual freedom and potential. And cultural complexes are perpetuated and reinforced over time. When individuals who have experienced trauma or oppression develop their own personal complexes as a defense mechanism, they may pass on these patterns of thought, feeling, and behavior to their offspring and peers through socialization processes. These, in turn, can become cultural complexes, which can become deeply ingrained in a culture or society, and can shape social norms, values, and behaviors in ways that perpetuate the original trauma or oppression. So what also should be kept in mind is that the source of cultural complexes are not socially constructed, in the sense that they often arise as a response to external factors such as trauma, oppression, and cultural clashes. However, the perpetuation and reinforcement of cultural complexes is often influenced by social and cultural dynamics. And these cultural complexes, next to dogma, can distort the essence of the archetypal energies. Cultural complexes can then also lead to dogmatic adherence to certain cultural norms and values, which may not align with the deeper essence of these archetypal energies. This is because dogma's rigidity often hinders the adaptation of rituals to changing environmental and societal conditions. So rituals that were once intimately linked to the rhythms of nature and the community's needs may become obsolete or irrelevant, contributing to the disconnect. And the collective unconscious, as a source of archetypal symbols and wisdom, can then also be a wellspring of inspiration for societal rituals. But dogma can disconnect these rituals from this deep well of collective wisdom, limiting their transformative potential. And as a civilization loses its ability to adapt, renew, and revitalize its structures, it becomes increasingly vulnerable to external pressures and internal strife. The erosion of cultural identity, spiritual depth, and the ability to connect with archetypal and natural patterns can ultimately contribute to the long-term collapse of the civilization. And when it now comes to, symbolism, this serves as the bridge between our conscious minds and the archetypal energies within the collective unconscious. And in that way, symbols are powerful tools for expressing and connecting with these archetypes, as they are the language of the unconscious mind and play a significant role in dreams, myths, and cultural narratives. And Jung believed that symbols were the key to accessing and understanding the deeper layers of the human psyche. And by exploring and working with symbols, individuals can access the rich tapestry of archetypal energies residing within them. And these symbols are not limited to images or icons, but encompass a wide range of manifestations, including dreams, myths, art, and cultural motives. This can include the hero's journey, for instance, which is one of such a cultural motive. In many stories, a figure may find themselves in a heroic quest or adventure, which can be seen as an expression of the hero archetype, symbolizing the human quest for self-discovery and overcoming challenges. Yet also in dreams, this can play out as well, where one meets a shadow figure, for instance. And in such dreams, this can represent the individual's encounter with their own repressed or hidden aspects, connecting to the concept of the personal shadow, something which I will go more into later within the book, where another important cultural motive would be the creation myth. Creation myths in various cultures often feature archetypal symbols such as the primordial chaos, a creator god, and the emergence of order from chaos. And these symbols represent universal themes of creation and transformation. In the same vein, many myths feature a trickster character who disrupts the natural order. And the trickster is an archetype that embodies chaos and change, often challenging societal norms. Where finally, another common symbol would be the nurturing and protective mother, which can be found in countless cultural motifs, from mother goddess figures in ancient civilizations to contemporary representations in literature and film. And this archetype embodies the universal concept of motherhood and caregiving. And within many ancient societies, rituals, myths, art, and other cultural and spiritual expressions would contain such symbols. They then also used these means of working with the symbols and the archetypal energies to connect both to themselves and the world around oneself. Through connecting with these symbols, we can start to slowly within our own life unveil the archetypal energies within not only our personal shadow, but also start to recognize the often hidden aspects of the collective shadow, the darker and more repressed aspects of the collective unconscious, including the parts of our nature that we tend to deny or suppress as a culture. Some might not think, but is this not for a reason? Whilst it is true that the unintegrated form that resides within the collective shadow should not be expressed in its destructive form, it is not about expressing it in this way, but to understand the archetype itself, the duality that is inherent in it. the potential good it could do, whilst keeping in mind the potential of the bad it could do when the shadow aspect of it would come up. One example I love bringing up would be anger, which is an emotion. If we ground that idea down to a more emotional level. And some might be like, well, you should not be angry. Yet being angry, when expressed in a healthy manner, would be, for instance, about boundary setting or a general signal that a person crossed your boundaries, for instance. Then based on the situation, it requires an appropriate response, showing, that anger isn't just bad. And at the same time, there's also the more primal side of us as well, that is, for instance, connected to our survival instinct. And when in a dire situation, this part of us kicks in. Speaking from experience here, surviving a flood in Germany, it kicks in for a good reason. It is, however, when we are not in touch with this part of ourselves when things can get out of hand.